Hi, and welcome to episode 39 of Toke Signals TV, where we bring you the biggest in cannabis and hemp news stories every week. My name is Steve Elliott. I'm the editor of TokeSignals.com, and I'll be guiding you through the news. After we look at our bud pick of the week, got something a little bit different this week in honor of Beltane, since it happens to be May Day when I'm recording this, and of springtime. We have some future hopes here for you. On the left, the little guy is a Frankenstein strain. On the right, there's a hybrid called DJ Blueberry 99, which is half DJ Short Blueberry and half Cindy 99. Looking forward to great things from those two girls. Well, let's do the news, shall we? In Oregon and around the globe on Saturday, there will be something called the Global Marijuana March, and something that distinguishes the Portland, Oregon edition of the Global Marijuana March on Saturday, May 3rd will be that a congressman will be the keynote speaker at that march. On Saturday, May 3rd, nearly 300 cities worldwide, including Portland, will participate in the 15th annual Global Cannabis March. Portland participants will gather in Pioneer Courthouse Square to march at high noon throughout downtown Portland, accompanied by a police escort. Oregon NORML, KBOO Community Radio, and the publishers of Hemp News, the Campaign for the Restoration and Regulation of Hemp, are sponsors of the event. The keynote speaker for the event will be, as I said, Oregon Congressman Earl Blumenauer from District 3. He will be speaking immediately following the march. Musicians Mac and Dub in the Smoking Section, The Syndicate, Disenchanter, and Justin James Bridges have joined the lineup for the rally. It starts at 11 and runs until 4 p.m. in Pioneer Courthouse Square in Portland. Speakers for this rally include CRRH Director Paul Stanford, Paul Loney from Oregon NORML, he's legal counsel there, Leland Berger, a Portland attorney who's represented lots of cannabis clients, Roshan Riordan from Oregon NORML, Anna Diaz of the NORML Women's Alliance, Madeline Martinez of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, LEAP, and Oregon Attorney John Lucy IV. I think it's game over in less than 5 years, Representative Earl Blumenauer said, according to an article in the Huffington Post. There's no question that we're likely to see another state or two this year legalizing social use. We're going to see more medical marijuana progress. The crazy prohibitions on bank services and probably the tax disparities, those are all eroding, Representative Blumenauer predicted. Cannabis proponents agree. The war on the cannabis plant is a farce. The drug war is taking a last gasp. No political movement in America has made it this far without eventually winning. It's just a matter of time before marijuana prohibition crumbles, said Michael Bashara, Executive Director of Oregon NORML. All we want is freedom and sensible regulation, said Paul Loney, Oregon NORML's legal counsel. We just keep pushing for freedom. Whatever groups are out there, it takes everybody. That's just the beauty of this country, is that there are so many of us out there. There is a group that we can all join and have the same common cause, and that's legalize cannabis. 3 initiative campaigns, the Oregon Cannabis Amendment, Oregon Cannabis Tax Act, and the Control, Regulation, and Taxation of Marijuana and Industrial Hemp Act, will be collecting signatures to put social cannabis on the November 2014 ballot. Registered Oregon voters are encouraged to come down and have their voice heard by signing all 3 of these initiatives. And as I said, 11 to 4 in downtown Portland, that's at Pioneer Courthouse Square, and of course around the globe. Also in the United States this week, Republicans assailed President Obama for his administration's tolerance of marijuana legalization. Republicans on a House Appropriations Subcommittee on Tuesday assailed the Obama administration's tolerance of marijuana legalization in Colorado and Washington, but Treasury Secretary Jack Lew defended the decision to let banks provide services to legal cannabis businesses. Secretary Lew said the Department of the Treasury's Financial Crimes Division issued the guidance to banks in February to lend more clarity to the emerging licensed legal marijuana trade in Colorado and Washington state. But Representative Harold Rogers, the Kentucky Republican who chairs the House Appropriations Committee, assailed Lew, claiming the move was a rubber stamp for marijuana dealing, which is still illegal in most of the United States. Representative Rogers hysterically claimed that it would encourage illegal drug gangs to try and exploit the U.S. banking system, even asking, what about cocaine dealers? Shouldn't we give them the same break? If they aren't licensed or regulated by the state, how are they different from a drug dealer on the street corner? Representative Rogers asked, displaying a spectacular, nay, a majestic cluelessness, since the topic of discussion was licensed, regulated marijuana businesses in states which have legalized and regulate cannabis. Rogers said Washington still hasn't licensed most marijuana sellers, yet Treasury is allowing banks to do business with them. What the magnificently oblivious congressman was missing is that no marijuana stores are open yet in Washington. So he just worked himself up into a fine, self-righteous GOP fraud for nothing. Only time will tell if Kentucky voters are sufficiently embarrassed by the clueless buffoon to vote him out of office at the next opportunity, which will come this November. Secretary Lew said because recreational sales of marijuana remain illegal under federal law and in the other 48 states, banks had been prohibited from processing transactions from the state-licensed marijuana dealers, forcing them to operate on a cash-only basis. There wouldn't be any way to track those sales, Secretary Lew said, raising the risk of illegal money laundering. Without any guidance, there would be a proliferation of cash-only businesses, and that would make it impossible to see when there are actions going on that violate both federal and state law, and that would be a real concern, Lew told the subcommittee. We thought that the clarity bringing it into daylight was a better solution. Lew said banks are already filing some suspicious activity reports on some transactions related to the legal marijuana trade, helping law enforcement understand more about it, something that would not happen if all sales were forced to be made in cash. Even so, few banks have begun serving legal pot dealers, even with the federal guidance, according to marijuana industry sources and bank anti-money laundering officials. The guidance doesn't provide clear enough immunity from prosecution, according to banks, and requires due diligence that would be expensive for the banks to pursue. According to the federal guidelines, criminal prosecution of banks for money laundering is unlikely if they meet a series of conditions, such as avoiding marijuana businesses that sell to minors or engage in, quote, illegal drug trafficking, unquote. But when asked by Representative Marion Diaz-Balart, a Florida Republican, whether marijuana sales were still illegal under federal law, Secretary Lew said, our guidelines in no way change federal law. We are in no way telling people that things that are illegal under federal law are legal. It would be better if Congress set marijuana policy through legislation, Secretary Lew said, adding that the federal bank guidance was, quote, an attempt to have as much clarity as one can have given this unpleasant situation with the state law. Also in the United States this week, on a more positive note, we had a very positive development, although not far enough in the direction we need. Nearly 200 members of Congress this week told VA to let doctors recommend medical marijuana to veterans. This included 22 Republicans who voted with the Democrats on Wednesday in favor of an amendment intended to allow physicians within the Veterans Affairs system to recommend medical marijuana to veterans in states where it is legal. The bipartisan sponsored amendment unfortunately failed 195 to 222. H.R. 4486, the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs and Related Agencies Appropriations Act, that's a real mouthful, would have prohibited the VA from spending federal funds implementing a directive that prevents doctors from recommending medical marijuana to veterans suffering from debilitating conditions, such as cancer, HIV/AIDS, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. A Veterans Health Administration directive issued in 2011 forbids VA medical providers from signing forms that would allow veterans to obtain marijuana in accordance with state medical marijuana programs. This amendment, sponsored by Congressman Earl Blumenauer, a good friend of this movement, along with Sam Farr, a Democrat from California, Dana Rohrabacher, a Republican from California, who leans towards the libertarian side, and Jared Polis, a Democrat from Colorado, was the first of its kind to be introduced on the House floor. Our troops have sacrificed a lot for our country, and in return they deserve the best medical care possible, said Dan Riffle, Director of Federal Policies for the Marijuana Policy Project. Veterans should not have to abandon the VA system and the doctors who know them best in order to benefit from their state's medical marijuana programs. Medical treatment decisions should be made by patients and physicians, not paper pushers and politicians, Riffle said. Government bureaucrats should not be intervening and telling doctors what treatment options they can and cannot recommend. There is a mountain of evidence demonstrating medical marijuana's effectiveness in a treatment of a variety of debilitating conditions, according to Riffle. Oftentimes, medical marijuana is a safer and more effective option than traditionally prescribed drugs, he said. A new groundbreaking report this week in the United States. America needs to significantly reduce its prison population, according to the report. This report, released on Wednesday by the National Research Council, which happens to be the principal operating arm of the National Academy of Sciences, documents the unprecedented and costly price of U.S. incarceration rates. The United States has less than 5% of the world's population, but nearly 25% of the world's prisoners. And the U.S. continues to rank first among nations in both prison and jail population and per capita rates. Those aren't things we need to be proud of being number one in. As the report points out, this unprecedented rate of incarceration is a relatively new phenomenon in American history. America's prison population exploded largely as a result of the failed drug war policies of the past 40 years. This report was commissioned by the National Institute of Justice and the MacArthur Foundation, and it documents how the drug war has contributed to the skyrocketing U.S. prison population and the staggering costs associated with mass incarceration. The report points out that U.S. incarceration rates are 5 to 10 times higher than rates in Western Europe and other major democracies. There's something wrong here, folks. The report also documents the staggering racial disparities in drug enforcement and incarceration. The report calls for a significant reduction in rates of imprisonment and says that the rise in the U.S. prison population is not serving the country well. It concludes that in order to significantly lower prison rates, the U.S. should revise its drug enforcement and sentencing laws. It's time to end the United States exceptionalism when it comes to incarcerating its citizens, according to Ethan Nadelman, Executive Director of the Drug Policy Alliance. Our objective should be to make America average. We need to rejoin the family of civilized nations when it comes to incarceration. Even as bipartisan support for reducing incarceration grows across the country, I have two fears, Nadelman said. The first is that we will succeed in reducing incarceration rates by 10% or so over the next few years, pat ourselves on the back, and think enough has been done. The second is that we will reduce incarceration by at least that much, but increase by millions more the number of people on probation, parole, and otherwise under the supervision of the criminal justice system, according to Nadelman. Transforming America from a maximum incarceration society to a maximum surveillance society will be a very mixed blessing. Reducing incarceration involves more than just eliminating mandatory minimum sentences and harsh criminal penalties for nonviolent drug crimes, Nadelman pointed out. Removing marijuana from the criminal justice system through responsible regulation and taxation of legal markets would make a meaningful difference. So would ending the criminalization of drug use and possession of all drugs, and making it a true commitment to treating drug use and addiction as health issues. Ultimately, we need to reduce the role of criminalization in the criminal justice system and drug control as much as possible while protecting public safety and health, according to Nadelman. It is significant that this report by the National Academy of Sciences, with its harsh criticism of America's punitive incarceration binge, was funded by the Department of Justice's Research Division. This is yet another indication, according to Nadelman, that the Obama administration, after having done little during its first term to reduce incarceration, is now firmly committed to doing all it can to reduce incarceration. In Vermont this week, the state Senate approved marijuana dispensary improvement. A bill is going to the governor's desk. The Vermont Senate on Wednesday gave final approval to a bill that will expand access to medical marijuana for qualified patients. It will now be sent to Governor Peter Shumlin, who has expressed support for the measure. S-247, sponsored by Senator Jeanette White, will eliminate the cap on the number of patients who are allowed to access medical marijuana dispensaries. Currently in Vermont, only 1,000 total patients in the state are able to access the shops. This measure will also increase possession limits for dispensaries, allow them to deliver medical marijuana to patients, and permit naturopaths to certify patients for the program. The bill was amended by the Vermont House to initiate 2 studies. One will explore the possibility of adding post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as a qualifying condition for the state's medical marijuana program. And the other, significantly, will evaluate the potential impact of making marijuana legal for all adults and regulating it similarly to alcohol. The House and Senate should be commended for taking action to ensure seriously ill Vermonters have legal access to medical marijuana, said Matt Simon, New England political director for the Marijuana Policy Project. We're pleased to see legislators are beginning to explore the possible benefits of regulating and taxing marijuana similarly to alcohol, Simon said. There is strong public support in Vermont and around the nation for ending the failed policy of marijuana prohibition. In Minnesota this week, a law enforcement supported compromise wouldn't provide any patients with access to medical marijuana. A medical marijuana compromise proposed on Thursday in the Minnesota House of Representatives would not actually provide one patient with access. The unworkable proposal, which of course is being backed by the law enforcement industry, they just love it, would require a state agency, researchers, and doctors to violate federal laws in a manner never before seen in states with effective medical marijuana laws. Specifically, it will be preempted by federal law because it would require the State Department of Health to contract with a marijuana manufacturer to obtain marijuana for clinical trials. The proposal would also require researchers and doctors to provide marijuana to patients. This proposal and testimony from law enforcement officials this week demonstrate just how unqualified they are on this subject, said Heather Azzi, political director for Minnesotans for Compassionate Care. If they know what they're doing, they are intentionally trying to prevent seriously ill Minnesotans from ever being able to access medical marijuana, as he said. If they don't know what they're doing, they need to step aside and let those who do get the job done. Even if the proposal could be implemented, countless Minnesotans suffering from debilitating conditions would not qualify. For example, only 2 out of the 4 patients who are currently receiving federal medical marijuana from the federal government via its old investigative new drug program would qualify for state marijuana in the Minnesota program. Many of the patients who would qualify would be required to travel to their doctor's offices to be supervised every time they use cannabis. My severe muscle spasms and pain are not confined to a 9 to 5 Monday through Friday business week, said Patrick McClellan, a Bloomington resident who suffers from a rare form of muscular dystrophy. I use medical marijuana when I begin to have extreme spasms that can last for hours. I would not be able to get in a car and drive to my doctor's office, assuming they are even open and available to see me, McClellan said. Would these legislators and law enforcement officials be willing to visit their doctor's offices every time they use their medications? Patients should follow their doctor's advice, not follow them to work every day. People suffering from cancer or epilepsy should not have to travel to their doctor's offices just to use a medication that is safer than other drugs they have been prescribed, as he agreed. We have an update for Washington State this week. You've heard a lot of nonsense, but don't cut down your medical marijuana gardens. You'd think it all was a done deal if you were satisfied with the skewed version of the truth presented you by Radical Russ Belville's High Times story of April 28th. It sounds pretty cut and dried after all. Washington bans collective medical marijuana gardens, reads the headline, and the news doesn't get any better in the story. But the sad fact is, High Times, once a trusted source of cannabis news, continues to busily chip away at what's left of their reputation by allowing Belville to use the magazine's website as a bully pulpit of reportorial ineptitude and flagrant dishonesty. We'll leave behind after a moment the palpable glee with which Belville, long a foe of the medical cannabis community in Washington State, reports the supposed news. But before we do, let's just note that with it, Belville showed the same abysmal absence of class as when a few months ago it looked as if the Washington legislature would take away from patients the right to grow their own medicine in Washington. At that time, Russ, believe it or not, actually bragged in public that no matter what happened to the unfortunate patients in Washington, he and Oregon would be enjoying his 24 plant limit. Interestingly, Belleville, in his April 28th High Times piece, claims Washington's 15 plant limit is the biggest in the country. While you really have to wonder about the missing empathy, hell, the humanity of a guy who had taunt suffering patients from just across the state line, it magnifies Belleville's offenses that he was a vocal, nay abrasive, proponent of the very measure which resulted in patients' misfortune. Belleville has been so busy producing bogus articles claiming all of his predictions of great success for I-502 were correct, and those of its detractors were wrong, that he somehow missed the fact that I-502's brand of legalization just doesn't seem to leave any room for the state's successful 15-year-old medical marijuana law to continue. Russ infamously declared in the divisive lead-up to November 2012's I-502 vote that he was out of patience with patients. Yeah, you're sick and disabled. Sorry to hear it, the rectal one said. He found patients complaining about safe medical access being endangered by the badly written I-502 annoying. So he chose not to just ignore their concerns, but to actively belittle and attack them. Now you have the same guy who promoted legislation which would destroy Washington's medical marijuana community, crowing over the recent Washington State Court of Appeals decision in Cannabis Action Coalition versus City of Kent. The court ruled that collective medical marijuana gardens are illegal because they can only consist of registered patients, and Washington State has no medical cannabis registry. S. Bill 5073, which would have explicitly legalized dispensaries and created a patient registry, was mostly vetoed by the line-item veto pen of then-Governor Christine Gregoire. But she left in sections allowing collective gardens of up to 10 patients cultivating up to 45 plants. This is the section under which storefront dispensaries in Washington continue to operate, keeping lists of their last 10 patients, who sign in upon arrival and sign out upon departure. Belleville calls the operation of storefront dispensaries in Washington State as clearly illegal, which would certainly come as a surprise to the couple hundred collectives and their attorneys currently operating in the state, with many of them paying sales taxes. The city of Kent, Washington, banned collective medical marijuana gardens, despite SB 5073 allowing them, and that's when the Cannabis Action Coalition sued, saying the city had no right to ban them. But the city's legal team noticed that collective gardens were required to be composed of registered patients, according to the language of SB 5073. Kent, in response, contends that the plain language of SB 5073 did not legalize collective gardens, because collective gardens would only have been legalized in circumstances wherein the participating patients were duly registered, and the registry does not exist, the appeals court ruled. The trial court properly ruled that Kent is correct. Belleville lays the blame on the Cannabis Action Coalition for daring to sue the city of Kent for banning medical marijuana collectives. But of course, his writing doesn't approach anywhere near a reasonable grasp of the facts, and certainly it isn't even in the neighborhood of actual journalism. So Toke Signals decided we'd talk with some people who actually have a clue. Perhaps if Normal and the ACLU weren't so busy promoting I-502, they would have stood up for Kent's patients, activist John Worthington told Toke Signals Monday afternoon. To chastise us for doing what the ACLU and Normal collect donations to do is low-class shit. Rectal Russ has no clue about what is going on here, and he is a Normal shill taking shots at people that fought for the rights of patients, while the people collecting donations, supposedly to protect patients' rights, just sit back and let patients fend for themselves. Take shots at the Cannabis Action Coalition all you want, High Times, Worthington said. Patients know that you are joined at the hip with Normal, and now they know that you have hired the propaganda arm of Normal to spin the issue so people don't place the blame where it belongs, which is with the high-powered criminal pot attorneys, pages of them, who advertise in High Times and Normal, who should have stepped up so we didn't have to. These frauds should be no longer able to collect money from patients if all they're going to do is sit on their hands and then take shots at us for doing their job, Worthington said. Activist Steve Surratt, leader of the Cannabis Action Coalition, concurred in his assessment of the situation, and especially of Belleville's misinformation. So Normal and High Times feel that providing safe access to medication for patients is nothing more than a loophole that needs to be eliminated? Surratt asked. They believe that the solution is for patients to accept a patient registry and be forced to pay more than 50% in state excise tax on their medicine, which is already exempt from taxes under state law? Someone should explain how patients can be arrested and prosecuted if they don't join a state registry, and how this can somehow be considered a voluntary registry, Surratt said. It sounds a lot like register or volunteer to go to jail to me. If we had not filed against Kent 2 years ago, every other city in the state would have been banning and closing down every safe access point in Washington, Surratt said. Instead of placing the blame for this clearly political decision by the appellate court on the judges who wrote the decision, Rectal Russ and the I-502 sellouts who want to blame those who stood up for patients' rights in Washington. Who will they blame when we win? Surratt asked. I think we're all tired of these industry greedheads who keep rooting for the other side and who keep supporting the law enforcement lobby's position on medical cannabis. It will be amusing to watch the reactions of all these I-502 millionaire hopefuls when their dreams of wealth are suddenly dashed by the Liquor Control Board lottery results. Do you think they'll all be shutting down their illegal collectives and continuing funding Carrie Boyder in her efforts to throw medical under the LCB bus? It's absolutely scandalous that the kind of law group would post on their blog that medical marijuana activity, even patient cultivation in the home, is illegal under current state law, Surratt said. Certainly Hillary Bricken and the other attorneys at Harris Murray know that this is not what the appeals court said. This appears to be a blatant attempt to scare their clients as well as the patient community and literally scare up additional legal fees, Surratt said. At best, this scare tactic is reprehensible and unprofessional, especially for a law firm that represents medical cannabis interests as a specialty. Surratt also wants to point out that the District 1 Court of Appeals decision only affects collectives in District 1, not Districts 2 or 3, Surratt said. There's a map on the Toke Signals article of the 3 districts in the state, and you'll be able to see from that just the Seattle area, the West Sound area, is District 1, and the rest of the state won't be affected by the decision. I'd like also to point out that while the court said the collectives were illegal, there is no criminal penalty for operating a collective, Surratt said. No one should be cutting down their gardens at this point. The Supreme Court stay is still in effect until the outcome of this case has been decided, Surratt said. That decision will not come for months at the earliest. Before we go this week, let me direct your attention to a must-read story on Toke Signals. It is an infographic, and it's called Marijuana Prohibition Wastes $20 billion every year. You'll definitely want to check that out. It goes into some of the other things that our government might be able to accomplish with that $20 billion of tax money, as well as the racial disparities involved in marijuana arrests. It's an interesting and informative infographic, and you'll definitely want to check that out. I hope to see you here on Toke Signals next week. Until then, why don't you take my advice and stay lifted. See you then.